Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a supernatural horror film, Prayed for the Devil. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a little girl named Annie, who is praying to God in her room. She is begging to be saved as her mom tries to open the door, but becomes violent and starts banging the door when she realizes that it's been locked. Annie gets scared by her mom's behavior, and it only gets worse when her mom breaks into the room and attacks her. Years later, we meet Annie, who has now joined the Catholic Church as a nun. She talks to her counselor about how she was abused by her mom and states that it was because her mom was possessed by the devil. However, counselor states that it must have been because her mom was schizophrenic and suffered from mental illness. Annie maintains that this is the work of the devil and her mom had killed herself to be rid of the possession. Now, a short narrative text informs us about how nuns are not allowed to perform exorcisms regardless of the situation. Due to the rising cases of possessions, the Catholic Church has decided to reopen its exorcism schools so that young priests can be taught about the rite of exorcism. Now Annie attends a session where counselor talks about the scientific correlation to cases of possession. Annie doesn't agree with counselor's opinion, but counselor says that she has been around long enough to know the difference between possession and mental disorder. Later, Annie attends to one of her old patients named Goldie, and then she meets a timid little girl named Timid, who is said to be possessed by a malicious demon. Counselor is also there in the room, but maintains that Timid is not possessed, and she will prove it through science. Annie reassures Timid that counselor isn't as scary as she looks, but counselor doesn't appreciate Annie's humor, so she walks out of the room. Now, Annie and Timid have a bonding session, wherein Timid says that Annie is her favorite person. She also wants to know more about nougats, but Annie says she doesn't know anything about them. Later at night, Annie thinks back to some horrible memories where her mom would harm her while combing her hair. Suddenly, Annie hears a mysterious sound coming out of her room and goes to check it out. However, she is unable to find anyone nearby. The next day, Annie hears someone whispering her name, and she can also hear a baby crying, so she looks around to see if anyone's there. Annie is given a jump scare when Timid suddenly shows up, looking a little scary. Annie wants to know how Timid got out of her room, but she simply tells Annie what she learned about nougats, including how they have families. After Annie puts Timid back in her room, she can hear the whispers again, but then she gets distracted by the demonic sounds of a woman screaming in Bulgarian. This turns out to be a recording of a previous possession case, which is being taught in exorcism class by a senior bald priest named Baldy. He goes on to explain how God is the most powerful weapon that can be used against a possession case, and how priests must keep their faith while dealing with such cases. Annie manages to sneak into the class, gets inspired by this lesson, and starts researching about demonic possession in the church library. She also thinks back to how her mom would say that the voices in her head would tell her that the devil was actually after Annie the entire time. This led Annie to believe that she is a chosen soldier of God. Now, Annie wants to learn more about exorcisms, but she notices some gaps in the books she's reading. She goes to the librarian nun to ask for access to possession records, but is told that nuns are restricted from accessing these classified files. Later, Baldy complains to a senior nun about Annie infiltrating his classes, so she tells Annie to stay away from the topic of exorcisms because she is a female. Annie rebels by saying she wants to become the first female exorcist in the world, and then she walks away. Annie tends to Oldie by giving him a sponge bath, but he suddenly starts humming the same song that Annie's mom would hum whenever she would get possessed by the devil. Oldie looks back at Annie and mentions her mom, so she realizes that Oldie has been possessed. Annie panics and she tries to break out of the room, but Devil Oldie grabs her from behind and tries to kiss her with his snaky tongue. Devil Oldie demands Annie to let him inside her, but luckily she knocks him down and saves herself. This incident is brought to the attention of the head priest, so he discusses Annie's situation with Baldy and Senior Nun. Baldy suggests teaching Annie how to protect herself from the devil, but Senior Nun is against the idea because she wants Annie to be sent back to the convent. Baldy maintains that Annie has a personal relationship with the devil, which is why it is necessary for her to be able to defend herself. The head priest agrees with Baldy, so he allows Annie to join his class, but only as an observer. Baldy is glad to see Annie in his class and comments on how the times are changing. A charming priest student named Charm is also happy to see Annie in his class because he seems to like her. It's time for the practical classes to begin, and Baldy takes his students down to a room where they are to meet their first subject, Timid. Baldy states that Timid has already turned into a devil, so he asks for volunteers to perform the exorcism on her. Annie is shocked to see Timid in this state, so she raises her hand, but Baldy ignores her and chooses Charm and another priest to perform the exorcism. Both the priests enter the room and begin the exorcism process, but it doesn't seem to work on Timid, who finally reveals her ugly devil face. She is ruthless in her treatment of the priests and even deflects Charm by mentioning his little sister to distract him. Now, Devil Timid turns off the lights, and it causes both the priests to get scared, so Baldy tells all his other students to begin their prayers. Devil Timid charges at the glass screen and looks straight into Annie's eyes. She makes inhuman growls and flexes some disgusting worms coming out of her hands, while also demanding Annie to let her in, just like Devil Oldie did. With no other option, Baldy barges into the room and tries to subdue Devil Timid, but she plays around with him and hides inside her bed. Baldy removes the blanket, but gets tricked by Devil Timid's illusion and gets dragged onto the floor. Things get tricky for the priests as Baldy is temporarily knocked out. But then, Annie enters the room with a holy book and starts calling out to Timid. Her methods seem to work at first as Timid responds to her, but then the devil takes control again and starts choking Timid with her own hair. Luckily, Baldy gets back up, allowing Charm and the other priest to prevent Timid from getting choked. Baldy joins forces with Annie to exorcise the devil, and it seemingly goes away for now. However, Charm notices a drawing of a pregnant woman next to Timid. Later, as the group celebrates their exorcism, Charm tells Annie that the drawing was meant to remind him about his little sister. Annie learns that Charm's sister was assaulted and became pregnant with a child, but she lost the baby, which led her to get afflicted by a devil. At night, Annie finds her mom's corpse on a table, but it suddenly vanishes, after which her mom suddenly appears and grabs her from behind. Luckily, this just happens to be a dream, as Annie wakes up in her own bed. However, when Annie meets Timid in the church's hospital room, she learns that Timid is still hearing the demonic voices in her head. Timid carries on by explaining that the devil is showing her some bad dreams, where even Annie is present. This worries Annie, so she goes to Baldy and tells him about what Timid said to her. She is surprised to learn that Timid's devil is only seeking temporary refuge inside her body, and the exorcism was not a complete success. Fearing that she might lose Timid forever, Annie offers to help in completing the exorcism. But Baldy says that this won't be possible because exorcists cannot be friends with the victim. Anyway, Annie teams up with Charm, who distracts the librarian nun so that Annie can sneak into the classified section and go through the records of possessed victims. After scrolling through some cases, Annie finds an interview of a possessed victim who was released from the church. She goes through the tape and is horrified to see what happened to the victim's body. Annie takes down some notes and is able to relate the victim's thoughts and feelings with those of her own mom. She talks to Counselor about it and explains that guilt is the main cause of possession. However, Counselor keeps talking about trauma and mental health. Now the church starts to restrict access to Timid because she is going to be transferred to the Vatican. Annie immediately asks Baldy to reconsider Timid's situation and presents her findings from her research. However, Baldy tells her that she must believe in the word of the righteous and not go by her own research. Disappointed and rejected, Annie walks away, but then Charm says there's a way for her to prove she's right. He suggests that he and Annie should perform an unauthorized exorcism on his sister because he knows she's been possessed by the devil due to the guilt of losing her own child. Annie reluctantly agrees to the suggestion, even though she knows that this will land them both in trouble. At night, they both go to Charm's house and meet Charm's sister, who is lying unconscious in her bed. Annie begins the process, but then the sister starts to act up and scratches her belly. Charm reassures his sister that she can trust Annie, so she invites her to perform the exorcism. However, the devil takes over the sister, and the fan starts to speed up. The devil taunts Annie by saying he knows about Annie having an unwanted child at the age of 15 without even knowing the father. Suddenly, the sister's belly expands into a womb, where Annie can see the devil's spawn pressing its hand against the womb. She starts to suffer convulsions in her body, so Annie tries her best to console her. Charm begins with the exorcism chants, and then Annie finally convinces her to forgive herself. Her tactics seemingly work as the devil retreats from the sister, and her womb turns back into a belly. Everyone is relieved to have finally saved her, and then Annie has a word with Charm. She mentions what the devil told her about the baby she had when she was a child. It turns out that Annie had gotten pregnant in a foster home, but had to abandon her baby after giving birth. Now, Annie feels guilty for abandoning her baby because she understands the value of life. Later at church, Annie tries combing her hair, but spots a strand of hair that she pulls out of her eye, while her mom's ghost watches on from behind. Things get worse when Annie is summoned by Baldy and the head priest. There, she learns that Charm's sister had committed suicide right after she had left because the devil had simply retreated during the exorcism process. Annie is heartbroken from guilt, so she apologizes to Charm and willingly steps back from her dreams of becoming a female exorcist. Now, Annie meets Counselor, who tells her that she needs to deal with her guilt and trauma by reading a self-help book. Counselor also mentions that Timid has been released and is back with her mother, which gives Annie joy. However, she soon bumps into Charm, who tells her that Timid has become a devil again and has killed 2 priests along with the medical crew who tried to subdue her. Now, Charm shows Annie a crucifix that Devil Timid gave to him, and she recognizes it as the same crucifix that she had left on the baby she had abandoned. Realizing that Timid is her own daughter, Annie figures that the devil is using Timid as a way to get inside her. She decides to break into the seal-off section of the academy, where Timid is being kept. She joins Charm as they enter the holding cells, where some priests are already performing an exorcism on Timid. The priests tell Annie and Charm to walk away, but then Devil Timid wakes up and calls out to Annie. She suddenly turns off the lights and opens up her cell door, after which she kills the other priests one after the other. Only Charm and Annie are left alive, and they finally come face to face with Devil Timid. Annie is taunted when the devil says that Annie's mom had killed herself to save Annie from possession. Devil Timid also mentions that Annie could never be responsible for another life, which was why she abandoned Timid in the first place. Not being able to take any further torture, Annie invites Timid to hug her, but this only allows the devil to possess her instead. Charm takes Timid and sends her to a hiding spot, while Annie completes her demonic transformation. Charm tries his best to stop the devil, but he is knocked away with ease. Now, Devil Annie finds Timid and starts choking her, but then she can hear the whispers again. They turn out to be Annie's mom, who was always trying her best to protect Annie from the devil. Annie regains control of her body and places a crucifix on her forehead in an extremely painful sequence. She dives into a pool of holy tap water and finally defeats the devil, after which she comes back to the surface. Charm rescues Annie and takes her to the hospital immediately. Once she's better, Annie finally meets Timid as her daughter, and they hug each other in an emotional scene. After Timid leaves with her adopted mother, Annie meets Baldy and the head priest, who reward her for her actions with a fellowship in exorcism at the Vatican. Later, Baldy tells Annie that she must be careful because now that she knows the devil also knows her. As Annie travels in a cab, she looks out the window and spots a devil looking at her. Suddenly, she hears manly whispers and finds her cab driver sitting next to her, as he is also a devil. The movie ends with Annie taking out her crucifix so that she can fight both devils. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.